We're going to kick it off with SGP, student growth percentiles, SGP for short. But we would want to dive into what I think is a really cool resource that is kind of coming online for you now that your students have a testing history. Because if you think about it, most of your kids took the STAR test, whichever ones, in the fall, and they took another round in the winter. And since we have both fall and winter data for them, you can now get a feel for growth that occurred during the first half of the school year. And this is a really great time to be talking about this particular growth score because then what's going to happen is when you get to the end of the school year and they've taken a third STAR test of the year, if we've got a fall and a winter and spring, then instead of just getting a snapshot on the first half of growth year, then you can get a snapshot on how growth went across the entire school year. So this is something we haven't necessarily talked all that much about before because it wasn't super relevant until your kids had a testing history. We could have talked about our growth score, but it probably wouldn't have meant anything to you because until it's your kids in your schools getting their results, that's when it really becomes relevant. But again, it is going online for you. So we're going to talk about this student growth percentile. But before I dive into the delicacies around it, let's talk about where you will see it. So there's really three primary places that you'll see it. And my favorite one, and the one that most people tend to go to, is a report called the Growth Proficiency Report. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going there because, first of all, it needs to be recorded. I'm just getting rid of a menu here. I wanted to log in and just show you if you're in your Renaissance system, you can either go to reports and navigate to it, or you can choose either any of the assessments and then click reports. Either place will take you to the same area. It will take you to our reports interface. Now, when you land there, because I begun with Star, any of the products, it takes me to the Star/assessment tab. If you'd said just reports, you might have landed on the accelerated reader or reading practice side. But whatever way you get over here, once you're in that tab that says Star and Assessment, if you scroll down just a little bit, appropriately under the heading of Growth and Progress, there is a link where you can access your own growth proficiency charts. Now, I'll just click on the link and bring it all up here. You're not going to see anything on mine because it's a sample database and it's very limited. I don't have a lot of kids in here, but on yours, you would see much more. And there is the ability by using these drop downs to toggle between reading and math, to toggle between the different assessments, to look at different grades and those types of things. So let me just show you some mock-ups of this that'll be a little bit easier to see what you will see on this report. But this is probably, if not the most favorite report we had, it's certainly among the top ones. And it looks something like this. Now, what you're going to see when you get there depends upon who you are and how you have logged in. I'm starting at the district level. So if you're a district person, this is exactly what you're going to see. If you're a building level administrator, you're going to see the next level down because that is the building level. And then if you're a teacher, you're going to see one level down. Basically, what this is doing is it's saying if you're a district person, you can see it all. If you're a building person, you can see it all in your school. And if you're a teacher, you can see it all for your classes and your students. So if you're a district person and you log in, you'll see these individual dots floating around the screen here. And I'll help you try to understand how to read this and interpret it. But the most important thing to know right now is each dot then for you represents one of the schools that you oversee. Now, again, it's not a live version, so it won't behave just so. But you can envision that as I scroll over these, whenever I hover over a particular dot, that one will become illuminated. So in this case, if I hover over this dot towards the bottom right, it'll pop up and tell me, well, that's Park Elementary School. 72% of the students in that school met the proficiency benchmark you'd set for them. Their SGP is 61. We'll talk about how to interpret that. It's actually a great number. If you were the principal at Park, you'd be like really happy about that one. And within Park, this is data based on 450 kids testing. And again, if this were live, as I use my mouse and scroll over all these other dots, it again would pop up and tell me what these are. Now, I'm going to drill in. I'm going to show you what it looks like for both a building level person and a teacher. But before we even do that, let's just orient you about what's happening when you look at the growth proficiency chart. Whenever I look at it, and sometimes in some of our images and depictions, these things are there. Whenever I look at it, I think about there being a vertical line going right through the middle, right where it says 50 down on the bottom, around median student growth percentile. That's the growth score, okay? And I'll go ahead, and I have this on another slide later, but I'll go ahead and say this right now. The scale for this growth score ranges from 1 to 99, where 50 is perfectly dead center average. So if I put this red vertical line right down through the middle, and growth is going across the horizontal axis here, the more that schools are depicted by a dot going further to the right, the more growth they're getting. The more the dot reflecting any given school gravitates towards the left, the lower the amount of growth that they are getting. So 50 represents the average. Anything to the right of 50 makes us happy. Anything to the left of 50 makes us a bit more concerned. The other thing is, in looking at this report, people often say it's helpful if I envision this as being quadrants. Again, anything to the left side is more growth, anything to the right side is less growth. And then often people will also sort of envision, or even when they print these out, they'll draw them on there, another line running horizontally where we're saying, well, that's proficiency. Okay. So across the bottom is growth, up the side is proficiency. The higher those dots raise up, the higher the percentage of kids who are proficient in that building, the lower the dots are on that particular axis, the smaller or the lower the percentage of students that are proficient in that particular school. So when I add those two lines and I cut this quadrant, or excuse me, cut this chart into 4 quadrants, then what you begin to see is different headings for them. So any school that is over in that top right quadrant, that's a school where they are experiencing both higher growth and higher achievement. That's a great place to be. We want as many schools, as many classrooms, as many teachers as possible to be over in that quadrant. That's the place everybody wants to be. The next quadrant down below that is higher growth because it's more towards the right, lower achievement. And in many ways, I think that if you're not in that first quadrant, this next quadrant's the place to be. Because what it means is your students may not have started with the highest level of proficiency, but they're getting there. They're getting there at an above normal rate. They are achieving nice growth. The reason that I like that quadrant second best is I think it's a better place to be than to have high achieving kids who are not necessarily growing. So that's the top left quadrant where it's a lower growth, higher achievement kind of dynamic. And we know, for example, from, for those of you that have been around as long as I have, going all the way back to the No Child Left Behind days, whenever we evaluated schools just on proficiency, some people would say, well, I have some students, my kids start further behind, but I work really hard to grow them and I do a great job. I get a lot of growth. That would be schools in the bottom right quadrant, but we also had some schools in the top left quadrant, schools that were high achieving schools. And we never realized that with inside some of those high achieving schools, some kids weren't necessarily growing as much as we would like them to grow. And then, of course, that leaves the final quadrant, which nobody wants to be in, which is lower growth and lower achievement. Now, the reason that I think most people find this to be one of the most useful reports or interface for them is it brings together 2 metrics all at once. You're seeing both growth and achievement plotted side by side. In so some ways, it gives you a multi-dimensional view of what's going on. Now, as I said, if you log in as a district person, this is what you see. If you log in as a principal, you're about to see what I see next. If you log in, as a teacher, you're going to see your classes. So again, this is the district level view where each of those dots represents schools. If you are a district level person and you want to drill in further, notice the call out that's there. You can click to drill into Park Elementary, and you can then see all of the classes in Park Elementary. Basically, what you're doing as a district person is saying, let me look inside that building. So the next view you see is what a district person could drill into, and it's where a building level administrator would start. So either way, it could be I'm a district person and I drilled in to see the classes, or I'm a building level principal or a reading specialist assigned to that school or whatever. I log into that school. And so what I'm now seeing is the different classes in my school. Okay. So each of the dots there reference classes, and it behaves exactly the same way. As you hover over these dots, it will pop up. It will tell you what is the class, what percentage of kids were proficient in it, what their student growth percentile was, and you read it exactly the same way. And if you're a building level administrator or a district person can still follow this journey, you could then drill in and look at things by seeing either the students in that class or all of the students served by the teacher of that class. So not just that one Geometry 2 class, but all of the Geometry 2 classes or all of the classes collectively that a given teacher might serve. So we can keep on drilling all the way down. We started at the top, and by the time we've drilled down to all of the individual students within one single class. So you can go right down to see if there's something concerning to you. I might have begun up here and said, I'm really happy with what's going on in Park Elementary School, or Palm Elementary, excuse me. Let me look and make sure all of the classes are achieving growth like this. And then I see all the classes. I see some classes are doing a little bit better because they're more towards the right and more towards that upper right corner. I might be concerned about some of the classes kind of over to the side with a little bit lower growth. So if I want to, I can drill in and see the students or see the teachers and drill right on down to see how every individual kid is doing. Again, with that idea of a division right down the center that tells me to the right is more growth, to the left is less growth. The more the dots rise up to the top, the higher their proficiency level is. The more the dots are towards the bottom, the lower the proficiency rate is. In this particular example here, you see that it brought up the minimum proficiency benchmark. That was the benchmark that you've established. That's the same proficiency benchmark you've established on your screening reports that you've already been used. It just gets carried right over here so that I can see which students are above that proficiency cut and which kids are below. Now, that's kind of technical. I hope it's fairly intuitive. Now, remember a couple things that I said. Student growth percentiles are growth scores. I'll get into some of the details in a minute so you understand where they come from and how they work. But let me be very clear, because many of you may be saying, I want to log on right now and I want to see what's in there for my buildings, my schools, my teachers, my classes, my kids. What's in there right now is a student growth percentile for any kid that took a test in the fall and in the winter. And so you're looking at student growth percentiles for the first half of the school year. Okay. Now they will be recalculated when your kids take an end of the year test. At the point that you begin to get taking those end of year tests, then it will transition to a student growth percentile for the entire school year. What the system does by default is it's going to always show you the most recent time period. So, once you get into the spring, it's going to show you the whole year by default. If you're only in the winter, it's going to show you the latest time period, which is fall to winter. It defaults to show you the most current view, but all of these things are archived and saved. So if you ever want to look back in time, you say, well, let me at the end of the year compare the whole year's growth to the first half of the growth. You can do that. There's a drop-down menu when you get into that live report that I showed you where you can toggle around and you go back in time if you want to see. But the idea is most people are going in to see the most recent round of growth. That is what will be presented, but all of it is archived and all of it is saved. I saw a question there. It says, does the district set the minimum proficiency scale score or can we adjust them? That may be an in-house question more than it's a Gene question. So I see Michelle kind of nodding. You want to take that one?
Yes. Well, we use the state benchmark
Yes.
for the scaled score proficiency in our district, and that's a criterion reference score, which is different from the SGP.
Yes, that's a great point. Let's delineate two things. One, so what Melissa's saying is your benchmark is scale scores that are tied to proficiency levels on your state test. So we've done a statistical linking study to connect performance on STAR to performance on your state test. And so you're getting benchmarks that line up perfectly, the same levels and those types of things. Now remember, that's your proficiency. So your proficiency cut is how high or how low these circles are on any part of the growth proficiency chart. Growth is something else. Growth is how far they are to the right or how far they are to the left, with the right being better. Point being, you could have a kid that's low performing and growing really high. You could also have kids that are high performing and high growing, or they are high performing and low growing, or any combination thereof. So you're kind of looking at two scores because one metric is how are they performing in terms of proficiency? That's the up and down. And then the other metric is, and how fast are they growing in relative to other kids who are like them? That is the left to the right. And again, that's how we get those four quadrants of higher growth, high achievement, higher growth, low achievement. You see them radiating around the side of this report. Okay. So let's press on a little bit because it's one thing to know where the score is, it's another thing to know where it came from and what I should be looking for and when I could see it. Now, before we get into those details of, well, what is this student growth percentile? Who came up with this thing and how does it work? I want to finish one thing that I began. I began by saying that you will see student growth percentile scores and references to them primarily in three places. One is where we've just been. That's the growth proficiency chart. And again, that's the number one place. That's where most people go. In fact, for administrators, that may be conceivably, you may not even go to any other place to see that. It's just easy to get to. It's dynamic, it's live, it presents interesting information. That's one of the three places you can see them. The other place, very fittingly, is on the STAR or any of the individual STAR assessments on their growth report. Now, I had a title one I skipped on. I must have hidden here. Oh, here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes. So here's the STAR report. You can go into any assessment, click on reports, or again, go to reports and choose assessment. There's always a growth report. And what it does is it pulls all of the metrics together. And let me make it a little bit bigger so you can see it a little bit more easily there. Here's three kids, Amanda, Melanie, and Leslie, all in three classes. And I can see some metrics for them. The first two columns tell me about their student growth percentiles. Amanda's is a 37, Melanie's is a 6, Leslie's is a 56. It tells me what quadrant they would have been if I looked at the very same chart that we were just looking at a minute ago. So there is their growth score using student growth percentiles. And then immediately to the right are all the details of that. Based on what tests were these student growth percentiles based? So in the case of Amanda, she took a test on the 10th of August and on the 31st of December, and those were used to generate her student growth percentile. Further to the right, I can see how she did. I can see exactly what her scale score was. I can see what her percentile ranks were during that time. For those of you familiar with NCEs or normal curve equivalent scores, you can see those. I can see instructional reading levels and all those different kinds of things there. Okay, those are all different ways that we could talk about and consider the growth that she achieved. But really, I'll tell you what I told a reporter one time from the New York Times who was interviewing me about national level data on growth. I said to that reporter, if you can only look at one number, if you say, I've got so many things going on, I can only look at one number overall, I could build a case that looking at your student growth percentiles is maybe one of the more important numbers to look at. It tells you a lot of what's happening. Okay. Of course, we want high achieving and high growth schools as much as possible. But if I can't have that, then the next best option is to have lower achievement but higher growth. We're getting there. Because if we know that kids are getting higher growth over time, the fact that they are lower in proficiency, it's going to get better and better and better. What I don't ever want is a kid anywhere getting a low degree of growth. So again, three places to see it: growth proficiency chart, growth chart, and any time that your teachers are going in and setting goals for kids that you are putting into interventions, you will also see references to it right there. So for example, when it says select a level of goal, do you want a moderate goal, which is a 50 SGP, a moderately ambitious goal at 65, or an ambitious goal at 75? I'll explain to you in just a minute what those numbers mean. That is the way the growth setting or the goal setting wizard functions. Those are the three main places that you will see references to student growth percentiles. Now let's talk about what they are. Where do they come from and how do we interpret them? I told you their scale ranging from 1 to 99, where 50 is average. That means that anything above 50 starts being above average, and anything below 50 seems or begins to be a little bit less than average. They actually were developed by this gentleman, Dr. Damian Biederbenner. He is with the National Center for Assessment in Dover, New Hampshire. He created student growth percentiles, and he actually is an advisor to, I think now, over 35 states that have embedded the student growth percentile model into their state test is their way of tracking student growth. He is both the creator of these for states, and he started in Colorado. For whatever reason, Colorado was interested in growth, and he worked with them to do the first implementation of SGPs probably more than 15 years ago. But not only did he create these, and not only does he advise states, but he works with us at Renaissance because you see, student growth percentiles were originally put into state tests. Star assessments are the first interim assessments on the market that ever included student growth percentiles. And Dr. Biederbenner oversees their calculation continually. So every year he updates the calculations around student growth percentiles to keep them up to date. He personally oversees all of that. So he's the expert in the field. We kind of defer to him in that. Here is the main takeaway I hope that you will get from today. It's a really simple statement on some level that he made, but I think once we get into it, it offers some really powerful insights. Here's the statement that Dr. Biederbenner made: subtraction is not a growth model. Here's what he's talking about. Historically, if you asked schools and educators, how did your kids grow? We tended to do a pre-test, post-test model. We would say, well, they tested in the fall, they got this score. They tested in the winter or the spring, they got this other score. Let me subtract the difference. That's his reference to subtraction. Okay. Let me subtract the difference between the two. And whatever the difference is between the two, that will be growth. Okay. So our historical approach was pre-test, post-test. So for example, here's two test scores from a given kid. We might have done something like this. We might have said, well, this kid tested on the 1st of September. They got a scale score of 305, which was a percentile rank of 66. By February, their scale score had increased to a 407. That's up 102 points on the scale. And their percentile rank went up to 76. So they increased 10 percentile points on the scale. Okay. The whole point is all we're doing here is taking one test score, comparing it to another, subtracting it, and getting the differences. And now that is a way to present growth, but there actually can be some ways that are a bit more refined because student growth percentiles represent just that. As I said before, it is a scale that ranges from 1 to 99, where 50 is considered perfectly dead on average, where anything above 50 would be better than average, anything below 50 would be below average. But notice that first bullet there. This is one of the most important concepts of student growth percentiles, and it's one of the elements that would not be considered if we only did pre-test, post-test kind of thinking. If we didn't have a growth model and all we did was subtract one score from another. That is the concept that students' growth is compared, the growth that your kids achieve is compared to the growth achieved by their academic peers. Well, what does that mean? It's a critical part of the model. What do I mean when I say academic peers? Let me give you an example from another field. And I think when you see this example, you will understand why we want to compare kids to their academic peers. Let's say that you coach high jumping. You got two kids on your team. Well, hopefully you got more than two, but I'm just going to use two as an example. You've got one kid, Claire. She's new to high jumping. Never done it before till she came out this particular season to do this. She's new to high jumping. And over the last 6 months, she has increased her average jump height by 10 inches. Okay. So that's the dynamics for Claire. On the same team with Claire is Colleen. Now, Colleen's an expert in high jumping. She's been doing this for a while. In fact, she's so good, she's gone to state level competitions for the last 2 years and placed among the top. During the same period, the same time period, the last 6 months, her average jump height has gone up by 3 inches. If I say to you, who grew more? In chat, tell me, is there anything that makes you pause before you say who grows more? Is there anything else that you go, well, it might be hard for me to tell me that? Anybody got an idea about why that might be hard to say? Who between these two grew more? Give a couple seconds more. That's actually more than just a 1 or 2 word response. So hopefully somebody's typing out there. Another way I could phrase it is, well, what's the difference between these two? What makes comparing the relative increase in jump height between these two jumpers, what makes that hard to do? Anybody? I see Michelle smiling. You can save me, Michelle. What's the difference between them? Claire is what? Claire is a knock, knock, knock. Is this thing on? I know you're getting it, but again, I know you're probably eating too. Claire's a novice. Colleen's an expert. Think about how quickly sometimes novices can grow in the initial phases of their training. There, thank you. Teresa says their levels of ability are different. Okay. Now, if you say absolute growth, I mean, we can say who grew more. Yeah, Claire grew more. She increased her jump by 10 inches, while Colleen only increased hers by 3. But there's something about us that makes us pause because we say, but I have no frame of reference. Maybe increasing by 10 inches is very common for someone that's new, that literally knew nothing about, had never been coached down to do this. We might be able to get a lot of growth in that dynamic, but then we hear all these stories of world-class athletes. I mean, the Olympics are coming. The torch was lit yesterday. It's on its way to Paris. We hear these stories of leading experts who go to every degree of end to increase their jump height by a fraction of an inch or to shave a tenth of a second off of the time that they can do something there. So the concept of academic peers that I said in SGPs is so important because it would be something like this. It would be like saying, you know what? To understand how much Claire grew, let's compare her to all of the other kids who are new to high jumping. And let's see how her 10 inches compares to their growth. And Colleen, that expert high-level performer, let's compare her to all of the other highly trained, highly successful high jumpers. And then let's compare the 3-inch that she did increase. Let's compare that to all of the other expert high jumpers, which is basically exactly the concept of academic peers. Okay. So when we talk about that, when your students' SGPs are calculated, They are compared to their academic peers, and that definition really has two parts to it. They are compared to other kids in the same grade who started out at roughly the same scale score. So your highest performing kids are compared to other high performing kids from around the country. Your kids who are in the bottom 10% of performance, they're compared to other kids around the country who are in the bottom 10%. And you can see why this is important. Because if you've ever taught, for example, honors kids, you know it's really hard to keep them up there. It's hard to get that growth out of them. Okay. Also, too, sometimes kids that are down in the very bottom, it's hard to move them. Comparing your students to other students who started out at roughly the same point as they did and who are in the same grade level gives you a lot of reference. So exactly how are they determined? Here, I'll show you and we'll be done. There's the calculation. So take a screenshot, write it down. It's all in the technical manual. We don't need to, of course, we need to explain more. Okay. There's a lot that goes into this formula. So let me illustrate it for you. I'm just going to illustrate using one student. Here's Krista. She just scored a 775. So let's say this is her winter score for you in one of her schools, one of your schools. Okay. She scored a 775 in the winter. To calculate her growth, what we'd want to do is go back to the fall and see where she started. Oh, she started at a 742. Okay. Now remember, we want to compare her to all of her academic peers, kids who are in the same grade and who started out at the same point. So what we look for is all of the other kids who started out at a 742 in the fall in the same grade as well. We then look at how much she grew. And if we say, for example, that she has an SGP of 42, what that means is she grew as much as or more than 42% of her peers. Okay. So, for example, you would have to the left, I thought this had like an image and I'll draw it on here. I'm not the best freehand, but you get an idea. We could have this student who grew to here, this student who grew to here, this student who grew to here, other kids who grew a little bit less, and some other kids that grew a little bit more. When we're saying that Krista is at a 42 SGP, again, what we're saying is there are some kids, about 38%, who grew less than she did. And there's other kids, about 58%, who grew more than she did. She's right in there. She grew more than a lot of them, but not as much as some of them. And then I messed up my animations. Let me go back and clear that off there. There we go. Make this clean slide. You get the idea there. Okay. So it's where is she in that distribution? Some kids grew more than she did. Some kids grew less than she did. Now, as I said, it takes at least two scores. That makes sense. You can't say anything about growth unless you have at least two scores. These are the windows. To calculate SGPs, any score that occurs from the 1st of August to the last day of November, that becomes your fall. Any score that occurs between the 1st of December and the 30th of March, that becomes your winter. And any score that appears or takes place between April 1st, which we are beyond, and July 30th, that will become your spring score or a possible spring score. So any kids that are now testing in your school, anybody that's taking a test now, I mean, what are we, the 16th of April? You will have a spring marker so you can get fall to spring SGPs. Now, someone might say, well, what if a kid took a test yesterday on the 15th of April? Yep, that would be a spring score. So I'll have a fall to spring. Yeah, but we have another 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks of school. What's going to happen? If they take more tests in that window, it will keep on updating your SGP all the way until the last day of July. Okay. So there are some additional rules. It uses the earliest test in the fall window. It uses the latest test in the spring window, trying to elongate the picture and look at as much time as possible. It uses the center test in the winter. What that does is it elongates time as much as possible for any student as they are testing. Okay, so, if your students are taking multiple tests in the spring, that's fine. It will keep updating. If you continue to use STAR across summer school, so long as they take their last test by the very last day of July, it will keep on updating your entire school year SGP. Now, again, how do we interpret them? Again, it's that scale 1 to 99, where anything above 50 is above average, anything below 50 is below average. Again, here is Krista. She scored, or she had an SGP of 42. What most states and most agencies that use this for accountability purposes have done, they've defined some type of range of typical growth. Now, most of us are familiar with a shape, the bell curve, the normal distribution, whatever you want to call it. And I remember one of my psychometrician friends saying, most of us are right there. We're in the mound. That's where we are. We always like to think, and we always talk about, people being a little bit above. Most all of us are kind of right in here. Maybe a little bit above, maybe a little bit below. But the whole point of this thing is most of us are right in there. So even though we say that a 50 is perfectly average, dead right on average, what most states and most accountability agencies have done is created a range. And they basically say anything between a 35 and a 65 we'll call pretty typical growth. Anything above 65, time to celebrate. Anything below 35, time to be concerned. I put 33 or 36. A couple of states have done that. I even saw 60 to 40. But within our systems, most of our metrics are set up as a default of 35 to 65 as being a range of typical growth. Now, when you take a look at it, some people get a little concerned about that, but let me kind of explain to you what's going on. When you say the typical growth is 35 to 65, you really are shooting for 50. That's what you're trying for, but you're giving yourself a margin of error around that of plus or minus about 15 points. And why do we sometimes need a margin of error before we say, oh, that's above typical growth or that's below typical growth? We need a margin of error for three reasons. Tests have a margin of error. They do. There's just a margin of error built into every test. Stars, no more, no less than anything else. Every test has a margin of error to it. Kids also have good and bad days. So there's going to be a little bit of bounce. And I mean, my niece is an elementary school principal. She's got one kid. She says, I can tell you based on the way he walks in the building what kind of day it's going to be. And she hopes that kid walks in with a good stride on state test day there. I was thinking there was another reason in my mind, but it went out of the way. So margin of error, good and bad days on the part of kids. There's also a statistical phenomenon over time called regression to the mean, which simply means over time, even your high performing kids sometimes will have more normal or more average looking scores, and your low kids will spike up a little bit there. So when you're shooting for that 635 to 65 range, what we're saying is let's give ourselves a margin of error. Now, because you are giving yourself a margin of error, the other thing is if you see growth above 65 on the part of any kid or class or school, you can celebrate. I mean, that really is great growth. But also conversely, if you see growth below 35, in any place, then it is a reason to be concerned. So, for example, when we went back and I was showing you these reports, remember this one we looked at before? Amanda, 37, she's within the range. Leslie, 56, she's within the range. Melanie, with a student growth percentile of 6, that's a red flag. Something's going on there. I need to look at what's happening with her because what that means is 94% of the other kids who are in the same grade as she did and started at the same point, 94% of her academic peers grew more than she did. I need to look at that. I need to figure out what's going on. So you have the scale is 1 to 99, where 50 is perfectly average, but most people then put a range around it, typically plus or minus 15 points makes it 35 to 65. They celebrate when it goes over 65. They call the teams together when anything goes below 35. Here's the other thing to think about. And it's an important question. This is a basic of statistics. What you're in. What do I mean you're in? What are you talking about? You talking about a kid? One kid? Just one kid? You talking about a classroom full of kids? Talking about a whole grade of kids, a whole school of kids? My point is, when you're talking about one single child, that's when you're the most exposed to margin of error. Okay. So if I see an SGP of 45, 42, I'm a little bit concerned about one kid. If I'm talking about an entire classroom full of kids and it's getting lower, I'm a little bit more concerned. If I'm talking about an entire building where the SGP is lower, that is another part of this factor is, yeah, what's the number? How far off from 50 is it? And how many kids are you talking about? If I'm talking about one kid, I got to have that buffer, 35 to 65. When I start talking about grades or classes, I start looking a little bit more towards serene. I'd like it to be more towards 50 or more positive. By the time I roll it up into an entire building or an entire district, if I see a mean score that's dropping well below, I'm a bit more concerned. So part of this range or fluctuation must be balanced by considering how many folks are involved in there. Okay. So let me go ahead and warn you about something. Here's something I guarantee that's going to come in. Anybody that you're going to put this in front of teachers, anybody that supports your building, I'll just go ahead and tell you the question you're going to get. Here's what's going to happen. If you'll remember on some of these reports that I showed you, and these things appear on the dashboards as well. When some of these scores are calculated, it tells you to the side the dates of the tests that were involved in the calculation of that score. Okay. And here's something about the way that SGPs work that is, it's designed to be that way. It works perfectly that way, but it's going to give you, people are going to call in and ask. Here's the number one question. Most common question we get about SGPs. People will say, and it's usually about in you're not seeing it this year in your winter. You'll see it next year because you'll have more history. They say, why am I seeing references to scores from like last school year? Why would you ever look at a score from last school year to say anything about growth in the current year? Listen to what I'm saying. SGPs are always current. They are always reporting on the current time frame unless you have asked the system to go back in time. They are always current. They are always showing you the current year, but they may use a test score from a previous year to refine the process, to narrow down the data. Let me show you what's going on. Any test that is used from a previous school year is not used as a starting point. So if you look, let's say a year from now, and you're looking at fall to winter, it might reference a test back in the spring of the previous school year. Okay. It's not using that as the starting point. It's still using your fall to your winter. If it says fall to winter, it's using fall to winter. If it says fall to spring, it's using fall to spring. What it might be doing is looking back to the previous period to further refine the peer group. Here's what I'm talking about. Remember Krista? Remember her? We've been talking about her. She scored a 775 in the last round. She began at a 742. If that is all the information that we had for her, then every kid across that line who also started out near 742, that was her peer group. Okay. Remember, we compared. We said this is how she stacked up within all of her peers there. If we had another round of data, if we could look further back in time and find out where both she and other kids were back 2 rounds of testing ago, well, then we could further refine her peer group. Because if you take a look at it, this is where she is. All of these kids started at the same place 2 rounds ago. All of them started out at roughly the same point during the last round, which means this kid may not be the best academic peer for her. And this kid started a little bit lower. They might not be the best academic peer for her. All this does is it looks at previous windows of time, if they are available, to further refine the peer group. Show me kids that 2 rounds ago where Krista was, excuse me. Show me those same kids who were just 1 window ago, and then show me how all of those kids grew. This one does the thing I wanted. Now I don't have to draw it for you. Take a look at it. Here's brilliance in PowerPoint. I can't take credit for it. Someone else made the slide, but there you go. Now I see all of the other kids, all of her peers, how they grew and how she grew. Again, I have some kids over here that did not grow as much as she did. I've got other kids over here that grew more than she did. And when we say, for example, now instead of saying a 42, we say, well, Kristen's actually got a 43. Then it is. That's her position within all of her peers and how they grew. She grew more than 43% of them, which means that 57% of them grew more than she did. This is basically giving you, it's not exactly a norm of growth, but it's kind of that normative reference. It's letting you know of all the kids like Krista, how much did she grow in comparison with other kids that started out at the same place? I see a question that came in. Can we use SGP to help us understand why school-wide and district-wide, I believe, but these correct me if I'm wrong, are star more? So you can look and see potentially, Missy, where that might be isolated. So you could be breaking in. You're saying, I'm seeing I'm kind of repaying here. I saw some declines in math scores, and I'm trying to figure out what happened and why that happened. Yes, you could then go in and drill in and say, because you could be looking at the building level, and then you could sort it by classroom, by grade level, by individual classes. What you may find is some groups of kids within your building did not experience any drop, while other kids did experience more drop. So it will point you towards where higher growth may be achieving or lower growth may be achieving. So yeah, it can be part of that problem solving path that you want to follow to figure out, do we have a problem across the building, or is that isolated in a particular grade, or something like that? The other thing is, if you're simply looking at your proficiency levels, like your benchmarks, like how many kids are green or how many kids are below that, the other thing you've got to realize is different grade levels, when a criterion reference cut score like that is set, it's not the case that at every grade level, it's always, for example, the same percentile. At certain grade levels, I mean, if you look at the linking study, certain grade levels, the state is just expecting a little bit higher level of performance. So you may or may not be seeing a drop. You could be seeing, if you think about, I use an image of hurdles. So think about, like, let's say I'm middle school. You got the sixth grade hurdle, the seventh grade hurdle, and the eighth grade hurdle. Those are not all set at the same exact percentile. Sometimes the seventh grade criterion cut is a little bit higher. So sometimes schools will say, well, our seventh graders, they're dropping. They may or may not be, but it could be that the seventh grade level, what the state's expecting of them is a little bit higher. I wish I had the slides to illustrate that. I could make it cleaner for you, but absolutely, the answer to your question is yes, and affirmative. You can then use primarily your growth proficiency chart's going to do the best for you to drill in and explore and determine whether the lower growth is isolated in one area or whether it's a building wide kind of phenomenon. My guess is you will probably more than likely find certain areas where that may be focused. Other questions? Missy says, thank you. You're welcome. That's why we do lunch and learns. Let me add just one more thing, and I hesitate to go a little bit farther because here's what I will tell you. These scores are really complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot to the, remember the formulas I put up on the screen? You need like a PhD in psychometrics and statistics to interpret it. And I'll make this comparison. A friend of mine like went to pick up, his dad said, go pick up my sports car. It had just been serviced. Okay. Kid was 19. What's any 19-year-old kid going to do? He's going to press down on the gas, see what that baby will do. He said, I got behind the wheel. I pressed down on the gas. That thing fishtailed. I about ran off the road. I just about wet myself. I scared myself so bad I drove really cautious the whole way home. This is a really powerful score. There's going to be questions. If you see anything that seems odd, reach out to us. If you see something you can't explain, there's not a problem. It's not wrong. I guarantee you, again, Dr. Beta Benner himself has gone through every calculation that's in there. Every now and then, there are things that may look odd, but they're exactly right. So, for example, it is possible to look at a kid and see, let's see, so here's Diego. He has a percentile rank of 95 in the fall. The winter, he's got a 24, or excuse me, 84. we might see a really low percentile rank there. It's possible to see a high percentile and a low SGP. It's possible to see a low SGP and a high percentile. These move separately from one another. In the case of Diego and a high performing kid, here's why it's so important. And remember, I said there's several things that this considers. I said before, our historical model is plus or minus. We just subtract things. When we do that, what we miss is many other relevant factors. Well, what am I talking about? Well, academic peers, that's a relevant factor, just like we talked about Claire and Colleen. Here's another factor that is so important. Now, this is going to be the most scary word we're going to use today. But, my mom used to play that game of like, what did you learn to school today? Well, if you go home and you drop this one at the table, everyone's going to leave you alone. You're going to say, I went to lunch and learn and we talked about regression to the mean. Don't panic. Not that big of a deal. Here's what regression to the mean is. It's the statistical phenomenon inherent in all tests where over time some students experience more normal looking scores. What that means is as your high performing kids take star season after season, every now and then, not all the time, but every now and then they're going to have a more normal looking score. And in regression to the mean, what a more normal looking score for them means a little bit lower score. See the arrows pulling in on the graphic there? What that means is high performing kids every now and then will have a lower looking score. It also means that lower performing kids will have a higher looking score every now and then. That is factored into SGPs as well. So in the case particularly of a high performing kid like Diego, who starts out at a really high percentile rank of 95, anybody that's ever worked with honors kids, it's hard to keep them up there. It's hard for them to sit down time after time after time and get just as high a score. So when Diego took the test in the fall and he got a percentile rank of 95, and he takes it again in the winter and he gets a 94, our subtraction model says, oh my gosh, Diego's falling. He went down 9 percentile points. The SGP model looks at it a little bit differently. What it says is Diego's a high performing kid. That makes him really exposed to regression to the mean because regression to the mean is pulling everybody back towards the center. He had a fluctuation in his score, but how much fluctuation in scores do students who are high performing like Diego experience? The change that we saw, is this kind of a normal fluctuation for a high performing kid? Or is it beyond that? Is it more of a drop than we would expect for him? So, in some ways, SGPs provide context. If we look at him and we say, well, he had a percentile rank of 95, in the winter it's an 84, but it's an SGP of 50, what we know is that's kind of a normal fluctuation. Like he had a bounce in his score, but it's not a large enough bounce for a high performing kid to be overly concerned. Conversely, if it said that he had an SGP that was lower, then we would be considered. Working with Dr. Biedementer, he was sitting in a room one time. He said, SGPs give us the context. They allow us to know whether a drop like this for a high performing kid, is this reason to be alarmed or not? Is this the kind of drop that's kind of normal, just the kind of fluctuation that just happens, or is it more than a normal fluctuation? And again, I said I was venturing into that. That's deep into the weeds. We can keep on talking about SGPs because there will be more questions that will come up. But the whole point is it's a powerful, powerful tool that allows you to now look at all of your data side by side so that you can look at it jointly through the lens of growth of both proficiency and growth. How are our kids performing and how are they growing? Because we need to look at both pieces to get the true picture of what's happening with our kids. With that, I'll turn it over if we have any last minute questions or anything that came in chat before we get ready to wrap up.
We have 3 minutes.
Yeah, you're welcome to fire off anything in there, put a chat in there. I think Melissa's been taking care of a few things I saw in chat while we were going. I will tell you, it's kind of an exciting time right now because if your kids haven't tested, you can see fall to winter growth. As they start testing, you'll see growth for your whole year. I will tell you, here's what's common. In most data sets, not just STAR, in most data sets, kids grow more during the first half of school years than they do in the second half. We don't really know why. The theory is, um, they've come back to school. They get a bit of a jump coming in from the summer. The second half of the school year tends to be when we do our state tests. Things become normal. Kids slow down a little bit. So you may see, if you compare your fall to winter growth to your whole year growth, it might be a little bit lower. Every year, this was an interesting one. Every year we've ever tracked this at the national level, we saw that the fall to winter was more growth than the whole year overall, but one, the second year coming in from COVID, that year when we were like really finally getting back in, I think people were hearing so many reports of like learning loss. I mean, like we really just kept pushing until the end of the year. And so we actually saw an entire year growth level where the entire year was at a robust level versus the first half being more robust. So don't be overly concerned if your fall to winter is a point or two, a couple points higher than your whole year one. That happens a lot. But if you see that your whole year growth number is just as good and it's a good one to your whole year, well, that's a nice reason to be celebrating too. And again, remember what I said when it comes to looking at data. Are you looking at one kid? If you're looking at a group, that means a little bit more. If you're looking at an entire school, an entire grade, certainly an entire district, then lower numbers mean even more than that. Just keep that in perspective when you're reviewing any of your metrics, not just student growth percentiles, but any score off of any assessment for any purpose. That's something to be reminded of.
Thank you, Jean,
My
for
pleasure. Thank you, Michelle.
presenting at our Lunch and Learn today.
Always glad to, and be glad to come back if we want to do more.
And thank you to all our participants for joining us.